It is July 8th, and on this date in 1797, the United States Senate voted for the very first time to remove one of its members, after the United States House of Representatives voted for the only time in history to impeach a sitting U.S. senator. The impeachment and removal of Senator William Blount is little remembered today, but it represents a significant legal watershed, a test of the still new Constitution, and it caused a literal brawl on the floor of Congress. It is a cautionary tale that the nation should not forget. William Blount seems to be the very last person you would suspect would be impeached for misconduct. Historian Michael Toomey of the North Carolina History Project explains that the North Carolina native and eldest son of a prominent mercantile family was a patriot who served in the American Revolution as the paymaster of the 3rd North Carolina Regiment and for the state militia. A U.S. Army biography explains that although a regimental paymaster was not a commissioned officer with a command responsibility on the battlefield, Blount served under a warrant on the regimental staff and drew the same pay and allowances as a captain. He also participated in the regiment's march north in the late spring of 1777, when it joined Washington's main army in defense of Philadelphia against Sir William Howe's royal forces. While his position offered some advantage in maintaining the family's business, his business acumen was valuable for the Army, and his efforts helped to facilitate campaigns for the defense of Philadelphia and Charleston, although both were ultimately unsuccessful. William Masterson, in his 1954 biography of Blount, notes that he was made chief commissary for General Horatio Gates, where his merchant skills were valuable in securing supplies for the Army. He was present at the disastrous 16 August 1780 Battle of Camden Courthouse, where in the chaos of battle he lost $300,000 in Army payroll. After the defeat, he left the military to serve in the North Carolina legislature, Masterson writes. Thus equipped, the businessman left the military battlefield to enter that of politics, the campaigns of which would absorb his close attention to the end of his life. After a term in the legislature, in May of 1782, he was a North Carolina delegate to the Continental Congress. He resigned at the end of the year to return to the state legislature and returned to the Continental Congress in 1785. In the Congress, he was a staunch advocate of his state's interests. In 1787, he was appointed a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He was among the original signers of the U.S. Constitution. The Army biography writes that, despite some reservations about the final document, Blount signed the Constitution because, as he explained, in a democracy, the will of the people, expressed through their elected delegates, should be heard. He actively supported ratification of the Constitution when North Carolina debated the issue in 1789. But his time at the convention would earn him an important friend and a valuable position. Toomey writes, it was apparently during the Constitutional Convention that Blount came to the attention of George Washington, a contact that served him well when North Carolina ceded its western lands to the federal government. Commonly called the Southwest Territory, the North Carolina land comprised all of present-day Tennessee and stretched from the crest of the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The most important office in the new territorial government was that of governor, and for this position, Washington selected William Blount. Of his tenure as territorial governor, the Army biography writes, he performed a wide array of tasks extraordinarily well. He negotiated a series of treaties with the powerful tribes of the southern frontier, the Creeks, Cherokees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws. Drawing on his experience in the Revolution and mindful of the losses that had resulted from poorly prepared militia in that war, he organized the territorial militia, supervising its training and deploying it in conjunction with the militias of neighboring states to protect settlements and punish roving bands of hostile Indians. This combination of diplomacy and force preserved the peace during a period when the regular Army's single regiment was fully committed to operations in the Northwest Territory. It also won Blount the respect and support of the settlers pouring into the region. From that position, he not only managed difficult relations with the Cherokee, but he was instrumental in admitting Tennessee as the first territory to join the Union under the rules of the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, serving as president of the territory's Constitutional Convention. He was, of course, overwhelmingly popular in the new state, which sent him to the United States Senate. There it could be expected that the veteran of the war, former member of the Continental Congress and delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and personal friend of George Washington, would thrive. But he had other interests as well. Through all of his positions, Blount had served his and his family's financial interests, among them land speculation. Toomey writes that he had acquired 1,000,000 acres of western land. It's likely that through partnerships he controlled much more. but that holding became problematic. From this vantage point, he hatched a plan to manipulate land prices in the West, for Blount had accumulated far too many acres, and the market for Western lands had not developed as he anticipated. His speculations had led him into serious financial difficulties, the webpage of the United States Senate explains. In an apparent effort to extricate himself, Blount concocted a scheme for Indians and frontiersmen to attack Spanish Florida and Louisiana in order to transfer those territories to Great Britain. Toomey writes that he was convinced that land values would rise if the British controlled the port of New Orleans, and so he arranged for Creek and Cherokee Indians to assist the British in capturing the city from the Spanish. The scheme was surprising. As a member of the Jeffersonian Democrat-Republican Party, Blount's official sympathy was for France and Spain, and opposed Great Britain. The Democrat-Republicans often accused their opponents, the Federalists, of favoring Britain. Yet Masterson writes, in his attitude towards foreign relations, Blount revealed one of the most characteristic traits, namely, his clear distinction, when necessary, between political tenet and private advantage. But even more, he was plotting with a foreign government, potentially against the national interest. Masterson continues, while Senator Blount thus performed his political duties, conspirator Blount pursued his secret machinations. The plan unraveled when one of his co-conspirators, whom Masterson writes, by the loosening effect of his beloved alcohol, handed over a letter which wound up in the hands of his political enemies. The webpage of the U.S. Senate writes, unfortunately for the senator, a letter in which Blount thinly disguised his desire to arouse the Creek and Cherokee Indians to aid his plan fell into the hands of Federalist President John Adams. The letter was damning. Senate.org writes, the April 21, 1797 letter to his friend James Carey was written in the senator's hand, bore his signature. Referring to the upcoming coup against the Spanish, Blount predicted in the letter, the plan will be attempted this fall, and if the Indians act their part, I have no doubt but it will succeed. He assured Carey that he expected to be at the head of this business on the part of the British, and warned his friend to take care of yourself. I have now to tell you to take care of me, too. For a discovery of the plan would prevent the success and much inure all the parties concerned. When you have read this letter over 3 times, then burn it. Masterson writes that on July 3, 1797, while the Senate debated consular salaries and taxes on parchment, Senator Blount, bored with the proceedings, strolled from the chamber. When he returned from his stroll, Masterson continues, he returned to find the Senate in an uproar. Senate.gov writes, on July 3, 1797, President Adams sent the incriminating letter to both the Senate and the House, accompanied by a special message charging that Blount had sought the aid of a United States government interpreter to seize Spanish Florida and Louisiana with British and Indian help. Adams acted on an opinion from the Attorney General that the letter was evidence of a crime and that Blount, a senator, was liable to impeachment under the Constitution. For the first time in the Senate's then brief history, its power to expel and to convict in an impeachment case were to be tested. Surprised when his own letter was read to him, Blount asked for a delay to respond, but both houses formed committees. It was an interesting test of the new Constitution that Blount helped to write. It was unclear whether the position of United States Senator was covered under the impeachment clause in Article 2, Section 4. The politics were messy. Senate.org writes that both Republicans and Federalists found it awkward to take political advantage of the Blount case. Federalist proponents of impeachment were in the uncomfortable position of supporting a House move to impeach a senator, thus compromising the Senate's independence of the lower chamber. Republican supporters of Blount, on the other hand, faced the double dilemma of defending both a Federalist Senate and the treasonous Tennessean who had sought to benefit Great Britain, the nation the Federalists were often accused of favoring. Blount had first tried to flee to North Carolina, only to be apprehended and have his possessions confiscated. Senate.gov writes that on July 7th, the House concluded, after a spirited debate, that a senator was an impeachable official and ordered the chairman of its committee to inform the Senate that the House planned to present articles of impeachment. The next day, the House voted 41-30 to hold an impeachment hearing, making Blount the first U.S. official to be impeached by the House. The same day, the Senate voted 15-1 to expel Blount, the sole dissenting vote being on a procedural technicality. Blount promised to return for trial and offered a $2,000 surety, and then went to Tennessee, and never returned. Senate.gov writes, in the succeeding months, the Senate unsuccessfully sought to take custody of Blount and return him to the Capitol. Although Blount graciously received the acting Senate Sergeant of Arms at his home, the unrepentant Tennesseans' supporters and state authorities warned the official to make no attempt to remove their friend. Still, the House prepared for an impeachment trial. The deliberations led to one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the United States Congress. On January 30th, 1798, Vermont Representative Matthew Lyon, anti-Federalist firebrand who had served time in prison for violation of the Sedition Act, according to ConnecticutHistory.org, accused the Connecticut representatives of ignoring the interest of their constituents for their own profit. Connecticut Representative Roger Griswold responded by insulting Lyon's war record, to which Lyon responded by spitting his tobacco juice in Griswold's eye. The move earned Lyon the nickname, the Spitting Lion. Incensed at the insult, the Federalists demanded that Lyon be expelled from Congress, but after 2 weeks of debate, Lyon's Democratic Republicans refused to expel him. On February 15th, after losing the vote, Griswold, author Tara Ross explains, walked straight up to Lyon's desk on the House floor, and he hit Lyon with his hickory walking stick. Lyon grabbed fireplace tongs and retaliated, and the two men fought until they were pulled apart. ConnecticutHistory.org explains the conflict became quickly satirized in the press, and cartoons of the brawl brought to national attention the division of Congress along party lines. While the fight was as much over tensions regarding the quasi-war with France, in the case of William Blount, it turned out to be a moot point. The House opened hearings in December, but in January 1799, the Senate voted 14-11 to dismiss the impeachment on the grounds that, having been expelled, Blount held no federal office from which to be impeached. The outrage against Blount represented rare agreement between the parties in a rancorous period, but in the end, the impeachment highlighted the polarization between the parties. It did set an important legal precedent, though. Senate.gov notes that while the Senate trial didn't directly address the question of whether a senator is a civil officer under the impeachment clause, in dismissing the case, it de facto set the precedent that a senator cannot be impeached, but rather the remedy is in Article 1, Section 5, in the expulsion clause, which allows both houses to discipline their own members and to expel a member upon a 2/3 majority vote. The scandal destroyed Blount's national reputation. Washington said that he should be held in detestation by all good men, but his reputation was still good in Tennessee, where he was elected to the state Senate and eventually was Speaker of that body. A county, a town, and several schools, including Blount College, which was a precursor to the University of Tennessee, are named in his honor in Tennessee. He passed away in 1800 at the age of 50. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community and locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.